Righty-ho, this is a series of PowerPoints on the other animals, and this is part 1 then. When we're talking about the other animals, remember that they are to be seen as allegorical representatives of the proletariat, the working classes. And if you want to make the point, you can point out that there is a sense of inequality created by the way in which Orwell treats the animals. For example, why do some animals have names like Boxer and Clover and Molly, and then other animals like the sheep or the porkers or the hens, why are they clumped together or grouped together without names? Because they don't have individual identities, are they seen as lesser? It might be something that you could argue that inequality is there just in the way that the animals are differentiated, that some are given characters and identities and some are just seen as groups. That might be a point that you want to make. But anyway, let's have a little look at the other animals. Okay, now just in relation to the first point that we made, the very first point that we made when we thought about Animal Farm, and that idea that the novel exists almost as a fable, and it has that tone of a fable, appears childlike, and the animals' qualities are immediately seen in a positive light when they're juxtaposed with the negative qualities of Mr. Jones. Remember, Mr. Jones is drunk, he's dissolute, whereas the other animals are seen as his victims. Any language that's used at the start in order to describe the animals is positive. Think of the positive language for Old Major, that he's highly regarded, that he's a prize boar. So we see from the very start that humans are described negatively and the animals are described positively. And the reason for that is because using the anthropomorphism, Orwell is immediately trying to make his audience see the animals as sympathetic. That wee point there. Now, again, we need to think about foreshadowing. Chapter 1's really important because if you look at it closely enough, you can see that the faults that become evident and become chronic throughout the novel are there in a lesser form, in a more subtle form in Chapter 1. So, for example, equality and inequality. We have the idea that animalism promotes all animals are equal, but even from the very start, from the moment that Old Major begins his speech, there is an understanding that ranking occurs, that there's a sense of a hierarchy. Remember, it's very hard for the animals to move away from their instincts, and there seems to be that instinctual need to fall back on some type of hierarchy. So you've got ranking from the very start. It's Old Major who's on the raised platform, remember. It's indicative or reflects his leadership. The other animals come to listen to him. They're absorbed by his words, just as they become absorbed by the words of the pigs in chapters 2 to 10. It means little now when we think of how they come into that barn and Old Major on the raised platform, and that's the actual quotation. But it does become more significant, ominously significant, as the novel develops, because it suggests that there are faults within the animal world even before egos, such as that of Napoleon, becomes so great and so glorious and so all-consuming. The dogs come in first. Remember how the dogs then are seen after chapter 5, how they are the shield that Napoleon uses to ensure his safety and to reinforce his control. As I mentioned earlier, that the idea of the anthropomorphism links to the tone of the fable, but also gives you that idea of sympathy. We feel sympathetic towards the characters. Now, chapter 1's really good for the anthropomorphism in terms of some of the animals. For example, the exposition of character, exposing the types of personalities that we're dealing with here. Gentleness is implied with Clover and Boxer. They're protective of those little ducklings and they're careful where they place their feet. You've also got that idea that Clover has never really been able to get her figure back after her 4th foal, and that creates a light-hearted, humorous tone. And that light-hearted humour that we remember in chapter 1 seems tragically manipulated and exploited by the events that happen later on in the novel. The attributes that are given to the other animals here in chapter 1 create the sense of sympathy that Orwell wants us to have, because then what happens is we really feel the huge impact of the treachery which is to come. From the very start, Boxer is given us, is presented to us there as completely positive. He's unambiguously positive, because he's meant to represent the proletariat and the working class. But remember, that's a simple way to see it in chapter 1. Everything is new in chapter 1. But remember, Boxer has his faults, and his faults are that he absorbs everything. He questions nothing. His stupidity, his obtuseness allows him and everyone else who looks up to him to be manipulated. That positivity that's there for Boxer is also then there for Clover, because those two horses are linked together. Okay, Boxer is best friends with Benjamin, of course, and Benjamin, his main problem is his apathy, the fact that he doesn't care enough to think or do anything about the situation that he's in. Now, here in chapter 1, perhaps it seems harmless, it seems innocuous, a word that we've used before, but it will become dangerous. His apathy, his apathetic attitude is what leads to the complete manipulation of the animals at times. If he actually did something, thought about something, remember, Benjamin can read. Benjamin is the one who reads what is written on the van of Boxer as he's taken away. The fools, your fools, he shouts. And he's the fool because he's aware of everything and yet he does nothing. And remember, that takes us back to the Edmund Burke quotation, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And Benjamin's apathy, which we see in chapter 1, doesn't appear to be a problem, but will become problematic. Molly, she's vain, she's precocious, it's there in chapter 1 and it'll be there all the way through. And what you've got is a nice little juxtaposition or a contrast between the gentle protection of Clover, okay, and Molly, who's just worried about herself and her ribbons. And that vanity that Molly possesses, it never goes away. And that's what is perhaps a fault of Snowball's, that he does not take on board the effect of the sort of instinct of creatures, that Molly is a vain creature and will always be a vain creature, and that wild animals are wild and feral, and they'll always be wild and feral. And Snowball thinks that ideology can take that out of a creature, but that's not true. He can say to Molly, liberty is worth more than ribbons, but really, Molly doesn't believe that. Now, what's important is that with the other animals, their faults, their flaws, they're there from the very start. Molly is vain, the cat doesn't listen, Boxer's stupid, the pig's his own power, and Benjamin is apathetic. And all of those things continue. And what Orwell wants us to realise is that dreams, the dream of Old Major, is always going to be threatened by the reality. That these things here, they make up the reality of life in Animal Farm, and they always will. And no matter how much things will change, those things will stay the same. And that is what perhaps Orwell wants us to realise, that dreams have to compete with reality. Okay. Now, if we think about Old Major and how he speaks to the other animals, he manipulates them just the way Squealer and Napoleon manipulate the animals later on. Look at some of the things that he does. Okay, first of all, he says man is the only creature that consumes without producing. Assertion, the same sort of assertion that Squealer uses. Okay, he's using that assertion now to give the animals something to believe in, something for the animals to hope for them to allow them to create a whole complete system of thought, as we find out in chapter 2. But it's assertion nonetheless. He uses a quasi-factual tone. He makes it seem as if it's an irrefutable fact when that may not be the case. He personalises his message. Look at this. He targets each animal individually. He says to Clover, Clover, where are those 4 foals you bore? You know, he uses her emotion against her, or not that it's really against her. He's not trying to hurt her, but he's using that emotional pull in order to make her believe what he says, in order to create a link between his thinking and her thinking. He's not afraid of scaring the animals. He says, "To that horror we almost come," when he's talking about the knife. But remember, Old Major is old. He dies in his bed. He doesn't come to any horror. So he uses emotive language in order to persuade the other animals. And he does it very effectively. But are we then surprised that Squealer uses emotive language later on? No, why should we? The pigs seem to have a particular position in terms of manipulation of language. Old Major starts it, and the other ones are truly his heirs because they continue it. Okay, Old Major uses naive statements. He fools the animals by giving them simplistic ideas of what can happen. Almost overnight, we could be rich and free. It's an oversimplification, isn't it? But he knows that perhaps the mental ability of the animals is lesser than his, and therefore he can give these simplistic statements and they will be accepted. He also has that idea of pinpointing the enemy, only get rid of man. That's too simplistic, because as we saw in two slides back, faults are there within the animal kingdom as we speak, so only getting rid of man is not going to get rid of Molly's vanity or Boxer's stupidity. And therefore these simple judgments show that Old Major is reliant and relying on the animals being stupid and absorbing what he says unquestioningly. He's too simplistic. He gives maxims, not solutions. Okay? Comes up with slogans, not solutions. All men are enemies, all animals are equal. As he stands on his raised platform, you can perhaps work out the hypocrisy in that one. But again, that's something that we see with Boxer. He goes for those simple little maxims, never thinks of the impact of what he's saying, just absorbs it. And that's something that Old Major begins in chapter 1, and it does have an impact upon the other animals. They believe him. Okay, if we think about the way that first chapter in relation to the other animals is structured, it's structured to create humour and also perhaps give us this idea of criticism. It's satirical. All animals are comrades, and immediately once Old Major says that, it's followed by a tremendous uproar as the wild animals are met with the aggression of the dogs. So what actually happens in fact, the tremendous uproar, the action that happens, totally disregards what is said. So here is the thought, here is the belief that is stated, and then it's completely contradicted by the action. And is that not a wonderful way of foreshadowing what happens in the rest of the novel? You know, you've got the 7 commandments written on the wall, and yet each and every one of them is immediately, well, within the space of the novel, contradicted by the actions of the pigs. The structure sort of refutes or denies or challenges the legitimacy of what Old Major is asserting. It's that idea that you can be as convincing as you want to be with your rhetoric. You can use whatever sophisticated techniques that you will, but sometimes natural instinct is going to cause you a problem. And the natural instinct of these animals will not allow simple ideas like all animals are comrades to be maintained completely. Okay, now the simplicity of the other animals, their eagerness and desire to believe the oversimplification of Old Major's dream is perhaps reinforced by the idea that they believe, as it's stated, that naturally the pigs should be the leaders. Naturally they should be the educators. It's never thought of or challenged. And again, it creates that idea of a hierarchy of thought. Also, in relation to that hierarchy, let's think about the power that hierarchy is based on. And there's 3 different types of power: physical power, and that's Napoleon; intellectual power, Snowball; rhetorical power, Squealer. That level of power and that level of control lets you know that even from chapter 2, the other animals don't have a chance. They are completely and utterly harnessed by the pigs and their ability to communicate and to reinforce their message physically, intellectually and rhetorically. Okay, So what do the pigs do? What does the triumvirate of the pigs do? Well, it creates a complete system of thought. A complete system of thought. Where's the opportunity there for the animals to develop anything for themselves? Well, there isn't. That's the case. It's a complete system of thought. The others can only be dumb followers. So what you have here is a lovely sense of irony. Irony lies in the fact that complicating old major's dream of equality creates a system of inequality based on those who understand and those who don't. And that's what is continued. But it's maybe not even as simple as that, because Benjamin does understand. He just chooses to do nothing about it. Okay, so how are those other animals controlled? Well, they're controlled by different means. First of all, look here at Snowball and what he promises. Glittering generalities. He promises liberty. Liberty to animals who don't really understand what the meaning of that word is. And yet they know it's positive. They know that they want it. It sounds like something that everybody would want. And therefore they believe in that. They believe in the idea of liberty. To the point where sacrifices are made. Molly has to sacrifice her ribbons. Now that's a sacrifice that she is reluctant to make, and of course she goes back on that sacrifice. But Boxer and his wee sun hat, that sacrifice that he makes, that's a sacrifice that he makes that actually causes him discomfort, because it was there to keep the flies out of his eyes, and yet he's willing to do that because he believes in liberty. He believes in these glittering generalities that he's promised. Okay. When we think about the other animals, a really good quotation is that they had difficulty in thinking anything for themselves. They had difficulty in thinking anything out for themselves. And the limitations of the animals in terms of their mental acuity, in terms of their brain power, that will always mean that they are going to be at the bottom of this hierarchy, that they will never progress because they're not thinking, they're not challenging, they're not questioning. And again, that verb choice, absorbed, that we've talked about so often, that they absorb everything in with a lack of discernment, that they do not question, they just absorb it all. Okay, well, let's think about something positive for the animals in a minute. When they do manage to achieve the glorious thing, and that's a wee quotation, that wee glorious thing description, when they do manage to achieve that, when they manage to boot off the farm Mr. Jones, you have this idea, this one wonderful little phrase, with one accord. Now, this phrase is a motif, which means it's a repeated phrase. It will occur again and again throughout the novel. And with one accord, what they do is they begin the rebellion, and it shows this unity of purpose, that they're trying to work together to create this collective idea. So what they do is they begin the rebellion with the power of collectivism, with one accord. I think it is that they start that rebellion. And look out for this phrase, because it happens so often. And you've got that idea of hierarchy, haven't you? You've got that idea that it fell naturally upon the pigs to instruct, that they come up with a complete system of thought. But that little phrase, one accord, with one accord, suggests the opposite of hierarchy. It suggests unity, perhaps something that was somewhere within the dream of Old Major. When they finally chuck Mr. Jones off the farm, just look at this, the euphoria, the complete happiness of all the animals. They gallop in a body right around the boundary. And again, just look at that phrase, in a body, togetherness, again, unity. Unity achieves great things. Unity got with one accord and galloping in a body, these two phrases that suggest unification, they got Mr. Jones off the farm. It's disunity and hierarchy that brings negativity into the lives of the other animals. But unity, shared purpose, collectivism brings happiness to these animals at the very start. There's this unrestrained delight of the animals, this simple joy when they've achieved their collective goal. It's childlike, links to the fable tone, the tone of a fable that we had here, and I'm going to sneeze. Oh, so that's the end of this one, and then part 2 is the next one. Okay.